I don't think people were smarter back then, but there was a gift to ancient China, which has to be recognized. Ancient China, of course, they had animism and they had a religion to a degree, but they never ascribed the functions of the universe to gods. So the sun isn't being pulled by Apollo in a chariot. Thunder isn't created by Thor up there swinging a hammer. They said, something's happening, there's a pattern, let's study it.
Andrew Nugent is the founder and president of the Association for Traditional Studies, which is dedicated to bringing the wisdom of Eastern traditions of medicine and mindfulness to the modern world. He spent 28 years in China studying Daoism, Chinese medicine, and martial arts before coming back to the States to translate and share this largely lost wisdom. In this conversation, we discuss the essence of the original teachings of the Tao and how to apply them to uplift your life.
So I always talk about it like the Tao is like a tuning fork. Boom! And we are all like tuning forks. But the truth is, through genetic disposition, social training, lifestyle, our tuning forks are covered in crud. So the point of following the Tao for those people was, how do I go about cleaning my tuning fork so that it goes Gong, Gong, Gong. And then finally we get to a place where, our tuning fork's going Gong. And what we find is, as our tuning fork gets cleaner, it starts to be more in harmony with that big tuning fork we can't hear. Life is smoother, life is better, we're less stressed about things.
Andrew shares how applying the Tao can be done by reading it over and over again, which can catalyze continuous perspective and insight.
In 6 months, I'm going to read it and I'm going to see and understand something that I didn't before, even though it's the exact same words. It is a perspective awareness of simplicity, of clarity, and then as I change my perspectives, it means something different to me every time. And that really is the definition of what the Chinese will call a jing, or a classic, is that there's no such thing as reading it and then you're done. It's just reading it over and over again, and you see more and more things in it as we evolve. That's what it's about. It's not trying to get what it means, it's trying to see how it tweaks my brain right now, how it affects me right today, and then how it's going to affect me next month.
Maybe the path to wisdom is less about discovering magic and more about simplifying our lives so that we can see things clearly.
And if we can remember that, things get deeper. And it's in their simplicity, when we recognize how more and more simple things are, that we see the miao in Chinese, or that magicalness, that mysticalness, that thing that everyone's trying to seek by going to the mountain. Actually, it's by recognizing how simple everything really is if we clear ourselves. What I call having a centered self and not being self-centered. The more I stop being self-centered and the more I have a centered self, the more the world stops being busy, the more I see it clearly.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey, Andrew, it's great to see you today.
It's fantastic to be here with you.
So, I think maybe where we can frame this conversation up is just understanding, when did studying the traditional arts become of interest to you?
Well, I always joke that, I was born in 1967. So by the time I was 10 years old, that was the first generation of parents who were getting divorced and it wasn't this big stigma. And that meant that I was babysat by TV on the weekends and things like that. And so I grew up watching Saturday afternoon Kung Fu theater, all of those kind of things. And I like to give my older brother a hard time. I had a very mean older brother who used to pick on me. So I'd get picked on, and then he'd leave, and then I'd watch these movies of the old guy who would do medicine and save the village or do whatever. And that definitely fueled, in a tongue in cheek way, this desire to have knowledge that was beyond ordinary knowledge, have an understanding that took us further in balance of life, and to be able to be protect the weak and heal the sick. And that was the theme of so many of those movies, and that fit a loop. I did a lot of reading as a child, and so I was reading a lot of books that also had that same kind of idea in it: good versus bad. There's a need to save. There's a role to play, and we have to do it even if it's hard. And so I was programmed that way from a young age.
And then at some point, you actually ventured over to China, correct?
So what happened was, um, I graduated from high school and I deferred a college that was well known for languages. And I wrote the head of the Chinese department saying, listen, I already speak three languages and I'm going to come to this university and study Chinese, but I'm going to take a year off, a gap year. I'm going to go to Taiwan and I'm going to study so I can place out of the first and even second year of classes, because my family background was we were raised with a lot of languages, so learning a language was never going to be hard for me. So he wrote back and said, don't go. Whatever you do, don't go. Come here. Because if you go, you won't come back. And I said, well, of course I'm going to come back to college. And he was 100% right. So at 18, I went with a backpack to Taiwan. And long story short, I had a motorcycle accident and I broke the bones in my foot. But at the time, I didn't speak Chinese well, and I didn't want to go to a Western medicine hospital. And I was training martial arts, and my martial arts teacher practiced Chinese medicine. So he was one of these local practitioners, and you would train in the alley outside of his little clinic, and then he'd come out and give you a hard time, and then he'd go back and treat patients. So I thought, let's find out. I've been watching this for months and months. I knocked on the door, and it was 4:30 in the morning, poor guy. And he turned on the light and opened the door and looked at me and said, motorcycle? I said, motorcycle. I said, came in. And what followed was probably the most painful experience I've ever had in my life. And now, being a practitioner of medicine for 30 some years now, I realized that maybe some of the pain was because I woke him up at 4:30 in the morning, and it didn't have to be that aggressive. But I was able to put weight on it carefully. And 2 weeks later, I was walking on what was a broken foot, all my metatarsals. And it was daily medicine, not a cast where you wait 4 to 6 weeks and then they take off the cast and then they tell you it didn't heal right. They have to break it again, or they tell you whatever they're going to tell you. It was daily treatments by the practitioner. It was a half cast, which means that you could put liniments and paste on it so that the bones would heal much faster. And then there was a lot of internal medicine going in to speed the body's healing process. So there I am, maybe just 19. I'm learning martial arts from this guy who practices medicine, and he heals this foot. And in 2 weeks, I'm walking around on what was broken bones. And I'm thinking, I have to learn this. And foolishly, I believed that Taiwan had become too American. It was very modern. The US had had an active military presence there until 78, and I was there in 86. So there was still a very American sensation to this modern city. And I thought, the mainland is where you have to go. That's where everything is. So at the end of 86, I moved back to the States, put all my things in storage, wrote the college saying, you were right, I'm not coming. And so I moved to the mainland. And I was very lucky. I got to Beijing in 87. And I did meet some very good teachers. But the truth is, there's good teachers everywhere. And while Taiwan seemed very modern on the outside, the thinking was very traditional. And in the mainland, you had very traditional things left over. You had monuments, you had the Forbidden City. If you get out to rural China, you have temples from the Song, the Tang, even earlier. But the thinking was very modern, or communistified, if we can make up a word. So I've seen a lot of people vanish into Taiwan and try and learn, and I've seen a lot of people try and learn in the mainland. And in the end, I don't think one is better than the other. It just depends on your luck and how stubborn you are, which means, are you willing to stick it out and stay there? Because, I was there for 28 years. And if I'd left earlier, I wouldn't have had the knowledge I had, because it's a challenging place to learn. And at any point, if you give up, the expression in Chinese, it's like rowing upstream. The moment you stop, you start losing ground. And you really have to get to a point where you just keep rowing, even if you've been worn out by the government and by this and by that, and had a problem with the teacher or something or whatever it may be. And you just keep staying there. And then one day it all comes together where you realize you have learned what you set out to learn. Just, it took a lot longer than, for instance, I always joke and say I could teach the skills that I learned in 28 years in 3 years. But the maturity, that's something else.
That makes sense. And when did the Tao start to come into focus for you?
Oh, I was so lucky. That's usually the hardest part in the mainland for people who go to China to study. Either they never find it or they end up in the temples. And there's nothing wrong with the Daoism that's coming out of the temples, but Daoism that happened from the last, well, from however you want to date it, to 200 Common Era to now, is a much more religious practice focused Taoism, because it was trying to compete with Buddhism. Prior to that, it was naturalism. It wasn't even called Taoism. It was called Ziranpai or Ziranxian. It was the naturalists. And then Buddhism came from India. They had gods, they had temples, they had all these cool things. There was fear if you didn't do something right. And if you did, you'd go somewhere awesome. And everybody was becoming Buddhist. And the Taoists were like, this is bad. Our own intrinsic belief system and religion is vanishing. So the next thing you know, they dressed up Taoism and it became a religion with incredible practices, right? Don't get me wrong. But if you go back to 2,000, 2,400 years ago, you go to Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, that time period, there was none of the trappings of Taoism that we understand as Taoism now. They were talking about naturalism. And when I first got to China, I very quickly met, he was almost an institution. You have to understand that when I got there in 87, you would go and all the Western embassies literally had an open door policy. So if you can imagine, you could just, as a Westerner, you could just walk into the US embassy, no guards standing there, and nothing needed. And they would all have these TGIF parties where it would move around different embassies, and you'd go as a brand new person in Beijing, and you'd be like, oh, it's so nice to meet you. The next week, you'd be like, oh, I remember you from last week. By week 3, you realized there was only about 300 of us, right? So it was a very small world, particularly of those who were there to learn Chinese, speak Chinese, be involved, right? Not the business people who were coming and going. And so there was this unbelievable scholar of classical Chinese, a calligrapher, and he had worked with David Eisenberg in 1979, who was the first MD to go to China to study for a 1-year Chinese medicine, met this Professor Wong, who was this incredible human being. Wong ended up being arrested by the police, having all the stories you'd imagine in a scary communist country, and being punished. And the way they punished him is said, you are so counter-revolutionary, we will not let you teach Chinese students. We're going to have you teach foreigners as an insult. So this guy, who's this incredible scholar, and I'll tell you about him in a second, is there teaching foreigners, but there's only a couple hundred of us who are there to really learn. So you ended up in this man's living room. It's a naked light bulb, cement, peeling. I mean, it's a communist block. He was put next to the coal heap because that was the worst apartment to punish him. And it became one of those salons, right? One of those places where you gathered. And he said, and it was just such a poignant moment when he said, my job is, you've come to China to see this beautiful thing, and you can't. My job is to show you the beautiful China that was and still is in the mind, just not physically outside the door. And he said, the reason why I'm doing this is that he would often say, have you ever heard of Chan? And when we would give lectures together, he would look at a foreign audience and say, how many of you know what Chan is? No, nobody knows what Chan is. And he goes, are you sure? And they'd all say, yeah, what's Chan? He goes, how many of you heard of Zen? Every hand goes up. And he goes, Chan is how you say Zen in Chinese. The Japanese came, studied Chan, they pronounce it Zen, they took it to Japan, now it's all over the world. If those seeds hadn't left China to Japan, it would never have survived. So my job is to give every foreigner I meet as many Chinese cultural seeds as possible, send them away and have them plant them in their countries, praying that one day someone will look up and say, the Tao, and it'll actually be Daoism the way he had learned it. And so when you have a person on that mission as your first hero, I lived in his house basically. I became his adopted son. He had 3 daughters, and suddenly this young man shows up who's in love with Taoism, who's practicing martial arts, who's studying medicine from him, studying calligraphy from him. That literally I lived there from 5, 6, 7 in the morning until the evening. And then I had to leave because if you stayed too long, the police would show up. And it was this sort of living with this person. And if we have the time, I want to talk about how unique or how lucky it was and how intersections happen that happen for a reason and yet are so hard to believe. Because Professor Wang, he was from a little village in the rural mountains of Shanxi. When I visited that village, there were 300 people there, total. So you have this little village in this rural mountain of 300 people, never been a lot of people. But this village happened to be on the path that the yellow sect Tibetan Buddhists would take, and they would go from Mongolia and they would hike, they would pilgrimage to the Wutai Mountains, which was the other side of his mountains. And for the very devout, they would prostrate every step of the way. So as a child, all summer long was people going through the village areas on their way to pray at Wutai Mountain, dropping and kowtowing or bowing their heads every step of the way from Mongolia to Shanxi. So That's what he grows up with, right? I mean,
that's crazy.
That level of devotion going on in front of you when you are 1, 2, 3. I mean, they're kids. I can only imagine the kids in those days probably went and like harassed these poor people or, whatever was going on. That's what's happening outside your door, right? Both of his grandparents were practitioners of Chinese medicine, and their only surviving child had been a daughter, a girl. And in that time period, it was not okay to teach women to read and write. And they were furious. So the grandparents, the parents of his mother, had her memorize all the classics. So Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Kongzi, Mengzi, the Neijing, and she could recite them all. And these people, they were all brilliant photographic memory. It was one of those gene lines where they were just super brilliant. So the mother had every text memorized since childhood. And in those villages, it was the women who worked the fields. So Wang, nursing on the breast, was in the field while the mother recited every classic book from the beginning to the end, and then started the next book, and then started the next book. And when she got through all the books, started at the beginning. And that's what she did every day, all day long, while he was on the breast and then on her back and then tagging along her side and then helping in the field. And so what are you going to do as a kid? You start mouthing all the words along with mom. And pretty soon, by the time you're 7, you have all the books memorized because you've been chanting them since you were on the breast, right? So this genetic line of these people, he's unbelievably smart. He's not very robust. So they're like, you're going to be useless in the fields. And he was sent to study from an imperial scholar. Now, when the dynasties collapsed, the last of the scholars all went to rural or urban places to leave the last of the Qing dynasty because they disliked the Republic of China, New China, and this modernism. And so this one scholar who passed the imperial exams at 15, I mean, can you imagine how smart you have to be to pass? That's like Stephen Hawking smart, right? to pass
Wow.
the imperial exams at 15. Right? The exams are 3 days long. They would have a doctor because people would have heart attacks trying to pass these exams. And this person passed it at 15, is disgusted with the Republic of China, moves to this rural mountain to be near the Buddhist areas. And then this young kid is there and they're like, go study with him. So he finds himself studying calligraphy, Daoism, and Buddhism, and the meanings of Daoism and Buddhism from this scholar who's bitter, has seen a fall of a dynasty, has seen the corruption of modern times, has seen the failings of what is beautiful to that person in China. And the failings are due to really human greed and what happened. So what happened was he learned what all the classics that he'd memorized as subtitles to life. The old scholar would say, you see that guy over there and he's doing this? That's this line in Confucius. That's what that line means. Look at how that person's acting. You see this? You see that? And so Wong began to see every line in the book in the context of how people were living their lives. Everything seems great. Then you have a Japanese invasion he has to survive. Then there's civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Then he's sent off to university to become a classic scholar. And then he finds himself for re-education of the Cultural Revolution in a chemical factory because he happened to be a scholar of classical Chinese in a time when the Cultural Revolution was all about that's the evil thing. So every lesson he learned about how corrupt and bad and foolish humans were by hearing the stories of this old scholar, he then lived himself. So that by the time we met him, he was like, you see this something, 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 that's this line in the old books. You see this something, 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 that's this line in the old books. So for me, and all of the three main teachers I had, same story, right? They, for some reason or other, they were befriended at a very young age by one of these last old scholars who transitioned from imperial China to the Republic of China to communism. And all of them were incredibly smart. And all of them learned from a very young age. Professor Wong was 9. Dr. Xie was 13 when he became apprenticed. Dr. Li was 15 when he became apprenticed to these last old people. And so all of them taught that the classics were subtitles to life. They weren't some book that we were supposed to read to become more enlightened. The truth is, the Tao Te Ching, what Zhuangzi wrote, what Kongzi Confucius wrote, what Mengzi wrote, was looking at how ridiculous life was and then saying, hey, here's a better way to be. The truth is, if ancient China had been a nice place, they wouldn't have written anything. And yet we imagine it's some magical place that all these enlightened beings were meditating on the mountain and getting the Tao. No. The story of Lao Tzu, true or not, is he was a high government official who was so disgusted, he got on an ox and left the country. And as he was trying to pass the mountain pass, somebody recognized him and said, you're not going anywhere until you write down something. And that's where the myth of the Tao Te Ching came from, of his words before leaving the ridiculous corruption of the time. And when we have that framework that these books are not to make us smarter, they're made to make us recognize how insignificant we are so that we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously for Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, or for life is really much better if we live in harmony than disharmony, then you get what Confucius and Mencius were all about. But it was in the face of a not wonderful world that they wrote these wonderful books. And that moment of enlightenment really makes reading the content much more accessible, because we stop thinking I have to be smarter to understand what this means and realize actually I have to learn to recognize these words in daily life because that's what they were written about. They were just written eloquently.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness, and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness, the Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. This is a big thing that I wanted to ask you about, where I think a lot of people, read the Tao Te Ching and they're like, oh, this is a very cool, poetic piece of work, but what do I do with this? Like, how do I use this to actually get closer to living a wisdom-filled life? And I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's one of the things that because I learned this in this sort of matter-of-fact way, when I started interfacing with the West, it was very confusing at first because everybody wanted it to be this high wisdom that they needed to attain, as if they weren't there yet. And when I realized is that we really have to separate out the Tao as two things. There's the big Tao, which is the macro existence of the universe, everything we understand. It's so big, it has no outside. It's so small, it has no inside, as he says. And then there's the small Tao, which is us trying to live in harmony with the big Tao. And really, what people turn to at first is they think that it's going to be like a manual, or it's going to have steps on how to become more wise. It's going to have meditation practices. Maybe there's a diet in there that will help me be more spiritual. And it isn't. It's these sentences. And what they were designed to do is, as we read them, to shock us into something, to make us think a certain way. But what makes them classics is that they're not a one sentence thing. So when I read it at 20, when I read it at 22, when I read it after I've lost a parent, when I've read it after I was just given a promotion, I'm going to read that sentence differently. And it's going to mean something different to me every time, because it's not giving you a specific direction. It's giving you a perspective. And so we don't want to try and understand it. We want to read it and say, what does that make me feel today? Does that do anything to me? Do I even care today? Or is that relevant? And I say, oh, that's really cool. It means this. And then I know, because of what it's about, that in 6 months, I'm going to read it and I'm going to see and understand something that I didn't before, even though it's the exact same words. And so it is a perspective awareness of simplicity, of clarity. And then as I change my perspectives, it means something different to me every time. And that really is the definition of what the Chinese will call a jing, or a classic, is that there's no such thing as reading it and then you're done. It's just reading it over and over again, and you see more and more things in it as we evolve. And that's what it's about. Is it's not trying to get what it means. It's trying to see how it tweaks my brain right now, how it affects me right today, and then how it's going to affect me next month. And that's the point of those books, is that the method is Lao Tzu talks about these ideas of just, in the end, how insignificant we are and how simple things really should be. And it was highfalutin to come up with a nice word, enough that his disciple Zhuangzi came along and he made a comedy of the whole thing. And his things are very funny, pointing out just how foolish things are. And so that juxtaposition of deep things that mean different things to me, and then having it interpreted by this person who comes along and says, let's have some humor for this, and see if humor shocks people into being more aware of their, and I don't want to use the word insignificance, which is true, but that we're not as important as we think we are, and that no matter what we think, what influence we have in the space of time, it doesn't mean much. in the space of what I'm doing here, it doesn't mean much to somebody who's in Germany right now. And so we really shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. And we need to be cautious of those who do. And more importantly, those who are trying to manipulate us into taking an idea seriously that we would follow. And everything in those books is always relevant. And for us at this time period where there's so many people trying to get us to think about something, the fact that there's lines in there that said, if you can keep the people well fed and without thought, which means without worry, without stress, then even if a person who can manipulate them comes along, they won't be interested. And wow, the fact that we live in a time where we are so distressed that we're interested in someone who's trying to manipulate us. Whereas what Lao Tzu is saying is, hey, if your life was good, if you didn't, in our modern times, if you didn't have a mortgage and a this and of that, and you weren't stressed about this and there, they come along and they say it and you say, yeah, so what? Who cares? And it never ceases to amaze me that what they were talking about in the old books, and then what these old scholars of my teachers, and then my teachers telling me what communism and the Cultural Revolution was like, and then I'm seeing it all right now in our world. You realize that that's the big truth: is that this is the existence we live in. It's always been like this. It's always going to be like this. And then the hope is enough people recognize it that the car doesn't crash and life just kind of keeps going along.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like the essence of what you're describing is like learning how to change our relationship with, this external turbulence that exists. And it's very interesting to me because I personally had this, I think, glamorized idea of ancient China and wisdom culture, that it was different, that there was these, Taoist sages doing really cool things and people were living harmoniously. And I had no idea that this was created in reaction to a lot of the same exact dynamics that we were seeing right now.
And I think the reason why there were such incredible practitioners was because of just how crazy things were. We don't think about it, but a lot of these books that we will venerate were written in the spring and autumn period, which is a time of constant warfare. And they were written in the Warring States period, which by name already tells you it's constant warfare. And so these books were written in a time when countries were warring with each other, vying for power, trying to influence each other. There was such strife. The truth is, Chinese medicine, a lot of people think that it's like so cool. They meditated and they found the channels in the body and they understood these deep, complex things. The truth is that when those classics were written, they were written in a time of such warfare that those people were watching war wounds and cholera and frostbite and epidemics sweeping through armies of hundreds of thousands of people. And you were seeing such a level of immediate illness and sickness and wounds and starvation and famine that you got good fast at this medicine. And if you juxtapose that with a broader perspective on how things work, you apply the Taoist idea of there is a cycle in how things work and how patterns work, and then you start seeing those same patterns in people. And really, Chinese medicine evolved as a medicine of war, famine, and suffering, and not of high meditation. Just like Daoism and these thoughts were, it's important as there were some incredible people, because the worse things were, the more you highlight individuals who do gain great skill. There's a wonderful section in the Taoist books, and it says, the best emperor or king is the one whose name no one knows about. And so, in one of the times when I'm teaching, I'd say, everybody, let's name some presidents. And everybody names a couple of recent presidents. And I say, come on, let's get some presidents. And, you end up with like 11 presidents. And I'll say, so who was the best? And people will say this and people will say that and whatever. And I'll say, no, according to the Taoist books, it's the ones whose names you don't know. They were the best because they reigned in a time of peace. You didn't need them. Nothing bad happened. No Watergate, no World War II, no scandal of this, no whatever it may be. Life was so nice that we don't even remember who was ruling at that time. And the fact that we had those great sages that did leave these great writings tells us that it was such a time of that juxtaposition of what they were seeing, the suffering around them, or the greed, or the power struggles that led them to having these very brilliant thoughts. I don't think people were smarter back then, but there was a gift to ancient China, which has to be recognized, that, ancient China, of course, they had animism and they had a religion to a degree, but they never ascribed the functions of the universe to gods. So the sun isn't being pulled by Apollo in a chariot. Thunder isn't created by Thor up there swinging a hammer. They said, something's happening, there's a pattern, let's study it. And a very interesting thing existed, which is anyone born knowing, 生而知者者 in Chinese, those who are born knowing, regardless of where they were from, poor, rich, countryside, city, had to be sent to the king. So the kings, the emperors, however you want to call them in those time periods, were surrounded with the Stephen Hawkings of whoever was born. And those Stephen Hawkings were then tasked with trying to figure out what is the pattern of the world? What is the pattern of the universe? So you had a concentration of incredibly intelligent people who are the Stephen Hawkings of that time put in government. Imagine if our Congress was full of those people instead of that wonderful email that used to go around that said, 50% are criminals, 50% are something, how many have filed bankruptcy, that wonderful sort of litany of who's really in charge there. The only problem to that is that if any of them turned evil or were bad or were manipulative, you had a really smart person doing bad things. Because what has a front has a back. The bigger the front, the bigger the back. And no shortage of dynasties ended because you had a weak monarch and very intelligent Machiavellian people, giving them advice. And it really paints a telenovela reality of what was producing this cauldron, this crucible of incredible skills and knowledge. And that's what created what I venerate. And having to recognize that that's what created it has made it much more human and acceptable for me to be in the time period I live now and not think, woe is us, whatever happened to the wise times. Nope, this is the same times as always. And because of what's going on, we're going to see some incredible people show up who are going to really do very interesting things. The worse it gets, the more we're going to have these people who we're going to talk about for hundreds or thousands of years. But it took the bad to make us aware of the good. Now that I know what I know, I would much prefer if none of us knew anybody and everything was just fine. But what are you going to do?
Yeah, very, very interesting thing. So naturalism, it was essentially a reaction. And what was the essence of naturalism?
Well, what was great is that in the absence of ascribing the natural world to gods or influences, but looking for patterns, it was the study for patterns, for habits, for cycles. And in the medicine world, I stress that if we can't explain to our patient their illness, why they got sick, and how we're going to get to them better with an analogy, a simile, or a metaphor that's drawn from nature, then probably we aren't understanding it ourselves. Because that's what they were looking for in that language of how do they ascribe that. And in terms of practices, what they realized is that life's a lot better if you're in harmony with things than not in harmony with things. So I use the analogy of a tuning fork. One of the things Lao Tzu says is the Tao makes such a great sound that it makes no noise we can hear, right? And I've always loved that line because if you think about it, our planet is spinning at something like 200 meters a second, right? So Usain Bolt can run 100 meters in under 10 seconds, and the Earth is spinning 200 meters in 1 second. That's got to make noise. I mean, anything
Right.
moving has got to make noise, but we can't hear it. And that noise is so small compared to the Tao, whatever that hum is. So I always talk about it like the Tao is like a tuning fork. Boom! And we are all like tuning forks. But the truth is, through genetic disposition, social training, lifestyle, our tuning forks are covered in crud. So the point of following the Tao for those people was, how do I go about cleaning my tuning fork so that it goes Gong, Gong, Gong. And then finally we get to a place where, our tuning fork's going Gong. And what we find is as our tuning fork gets cleaner, it starts to be more in harmony with that big tuning fork we can't hear. Life is smoother, life is better, we're less stressed about things, and we begin to dislike being around people whose tuning forks aren't too clean yet. So then we're more selective about who we spend time with, what we're doing, and then the tuning fork that we are is in harmony. As small as it is, it's not in a jarring frequency with the natural rhythm of what the Tao, whatever that may be. So life becomes easier. Life becomes less stressful. Life becomes less shocking. We're less angry. We're less prone to emotions. We're less prone to self-desire. We're no longer fooling ourselves because we can see ourselves within the context of where we live, within the context of history, within the context of our society. And we go, you know what? That's not so important. This is. And that's why, as your tuning fork gets better and better, it's harder to be in non good harmony places. That there's always been a tradition of the Taoists heading out to be hermits in the mountains to get away from the bad noise and get closer to the good noise. And really, that's what it's all about. And I consider myself very lucky because if I had gotten to China in the time of, let's say, John Blofeld or some of those early people who were there in the 20s, maybe 30s, or the late 1800s, I would have had a hard time learning this unless I became a monk, unless I went into a temple, unless something like that. But communism wiped that all out. When I went to the sacred mountains that were by Wong's village, where those Buddhist monks would go to, I went 5 peaks, 5 famous peaks. I was young. I climbed every peak, and it was incredible how many places. Like the mountain had this flat area where you could practice Tai Chi and do your Qigong and your Daoism, and you're like, wow, no wonder they picked this mountain. There's so many flat places. How many mountains have flat places? And then your foot would hit this thing, and you'd realize that it was a pillar and a stone, and you were standing on a temple that had been completely dismantled and was covered with weeds and grass. So all there was the flat surface of what was once a temple. And Wong told me there were over 300 temples on those mountains. When I went there for the first time, there were three, only one of which was functioning, right?
Wow.
So all of that wisdom that was in the temples where you would go was destroyed by communism and was in the lay people. So I learned Taoism from lay Taoists. I learned Buddhism from lay Buddhists. I learned medicine from lay medicine practitioners because there were no temples to go to. When I started spending time in the temples a little while later, there was the official communist official who was there to make sure the monks were behaving and nothing was actually happening, right? And, they're bored out of their heads and the foreigner shows up. They're like, you're not supposed to be here, but you're kind of fun and you speak Chinese. So come on over here. And we won't tell the local police for a couple of days you're here. And you never actually get to hang out with the monks much, but you get to hang out with the communist official who's bored out of his head and gets to hang out with the foreigner and tell you how corrupt everything is. So learning everything I did in a lay world removed any belief that there had to be a religious aspect to it. and fundamentally put me closer to the naturalists where this all started, and not the religion of Taoism that came later in time. It was one of those weird things where because they destroyed one thing, it was easier for me to learn. Like my teachers, they'd all been belittled and pushed aside, so they were hard to find. But if you found them, they had nothing to do. They had nothing to do all day long, right? So all of a sudden you show up and you're excited and you speak Chinese and you get like communism is silly and you're not upset because something or other and you're just, I'm here to learn. They have nothing to do but talk to you all day long. So that was my life in the 80s and early 90s, was these very bored, cantankerous, bitter, mm, given up on life people. And then I showed up and they went, oh my goodness. And I gave them life and I excited them and I translated books for them and I took them to the United States and to England to teach seminars. I started a not-for-profit that was documenting their arts, and they were on this ride. And it all began because everything got wiped out. They were stuck next to a coal heap. They had nothing to do but talk to me all day long. So
Wow.
you never know
Incredible
how things are going to
story.
go.
I mean, it reminds so many things I'm thinking of like Mr. Miyagi and like the Three Ninjas, I'm
You
thinking of
got it.
all in business, like the old guy, 80-year-old guy who has nothing to do, but just has had so much success and wisdom. And it just, people don't even think to talk to that person.
Yep. And that's the one. It is, and one of the gifts, in the medicine world, it's not such a big deal. In the philosophy, classical scholar world, uh, Professor Wong would always say that he loved being a teacher more than any other title he had, because in ancient China, there's an expression which exists today, right? To teach the student is to starve the teacher, because the teacher's going to get old and the student's going to do it better.
Mm.
And if the student is arrogant and leaves you and doesn't take care of you in your old age, then you're screwed. You got someone who's younger, better, faster, stronger, and you're forgotten about, right? He said that's true in the martial arts world, in the Qigong world, in some degree the medicine world. In the teaching world, the only way you can become famous as a teacher is if one of your students becomes famous. And they say, where did you learn all this? And you say, my teacher. So that was his joke, was that he was desperate for anyone who learned from him to be more knowledgeable than he was. And that's how he would gain fame. Tongue in cheek, he didn't care about fame at all. But that idea of that. And if I had been older than for the other two teachers I had, the relationship might have been different. But I was considered almost like a grandchild. I mean, they're in their 70s, 80s when I met them. So the age difference was such that I was not a threat. I was entertaining, and I cared, and I wanted to learn. And each teacher had set me up so that when I showed up with the next teacher, what that first teacher had given me made me acceptable to the second teacher. They went, oh, you already know this? How great. And they started teaching me what they had. And then I'd get to the next teacher and they'd be like, oh my goodness, thank God. Because I'll tell you a secret, no teacher wants a blank slate. There's this idea that, oh, I'm a blank slate, or they want a blank slate. A blank slate means you have no idea what this person's going to do. They're blank. They've shown no commitment to anything, no perseverance to anything. They haven't developed any skills yet. You don't know how they interact with their skills. Do they get arrogant with their skills? Do they get money focused with their skills? Do they start sleeping with their students? What happens when they get a certain level of skill? And that's what the teachers at that level want to see. They don't want a blank slate because you're an unknown. Anything could happen with the knowledge they give you. But I was young. They had no one to talk to. And they were like, screw it. We're going to dump all this knowledge in this person and see. You know, by the time I met my third teacher, I'd been in China for 20 some years. And it took me from 1997, when I met him, to 2005 to court a relationship with him that he would actually teach me medicine. And one of the reasons is he's a Muslim Chinese. A lot of people don't realize there's a lot of Muslim Chinese. And so you have this old, famous in his time scholar who'd been pushed aside, incredible doctor of Chinese medicine. If you were very sick, you went and saw him, but otherwise you didn't do that. When Pavarotti came and sang in China and he lost his throat, they went and got my teacher. Like, stop screwing around with the famous people. Go get Dr. Lee. It's almost like getting like Miyagi from the basement. Like, get the Miyagi, fix him, send Miyagi away again, right? So he's Muslim, and he's like, you're an American. I don't like foreigners, and I like Americans even less. Do you know what you're doing around the world? I'll never teach you. So from 97 to 2005, I courted a relationship with him. And I was very simple. I did a tried and true technique is I brought in patients who didn't speak Chinese and I translated. All right. And so I'm there as a translator. And the clinic, this was this very special clinic, was thrilled. All of a sudden, they had somebody on call who could translate for the ambassadors, who can translate for the famous people that the government was bringing in. And he's entertaining, and he's funny, and he speaks Chinese well. And I think somewhere in the middle of those years, Dr. Lee looked at me and he said, I know what you're doing. You're bringing me people, and you're going to see what happens. I know what you're doing. And I was like, no, of course not. And, we knew in China, that's how things are done. And in 2005, when my first teacher passed away, he said, my first teacher had passed away the year before, and then my second teacher passed away after that. He said, I watched how you were with those teachers. I watched how when they passed away, you were there to bury them. You were there to take care of them. It's time that you call my wife your study mother. What a wonderful Chinese polite way of saying I'm going to take you on as a student, right? It's not I'm going to teach you. It's you have a study mother now, which implied he was my study father. I love the Chinese, the ones who are really well educated. The way they're going to phrase something, the way they're going to have you make it look at it, it's beautiful. And from 2005 until he passed away 12 years later, our relationship really just grew and grew and grew. And he always thought it was the funniest thing in the world that his closing door disciple, his best student, the one that he was closest to more than his own children, because none of these people, Professor Wong did not have a problem with his children. He just wasn't very close with them. But the other two teachers, their kids were kids in the Cultural Revolution, so they became Red Guards. They denounced their parents. I mean, everything that could be awful happened to these people. So their family relationship with their children was so strained, so awful. And I became their child who wanted to learn, who wanted to do that. And up until he died, he would always just be like, what happened that it's a foreigner of all things? And the gift is that all of them realize that it's not about being Chinese or a foreigner. There's just a mindset. And if you're lucky, you're born towards this mindset. Or if you're unlucky, a major tragedy happens that shocks you into this mindset. And if you're somewhere in between, you slowly grow this mindset through reading the books and having life experiences where you don't get lost in yourself, then it's about the mindset and not where you're from. And at that point, they realize that it's a human conditioned state that gets it. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. And I think if there's any one gift I gave them, besides them knowing that their knowledge would not die as they thought it would, it's that they realized that this was not a Chinese thing. They just happened to be Chinese. And I think that was very freeing for them because to realize that the picture is bigger than ethnicity is a gift if you care about sharing knowledge.
The word, something that's kind of coming up for me is, would you describe this, this proclivity towards knowledge? Is that similar to kind of Gong Fu?
Yes. And, the biggest thing is that unfortunately, Gong Fu or Kung Fu in Cantonese, how they pronounce it in English, everyone thinks it means martial arts, and it doesn't. If you look up in the dictionary, it says Gong Fu, spare time. So if you're studying Mandarin Chinese in Taiwan where they speak an educated Chinese, by chapter 3, Mr. Bai is asking the foreigner if he has Gong Fu on Saturday to go to the park. So what Gong Fu really means is, what did you do in your spare time to master something? Right? So an artist, a painter, you'd be like, wow, 很有功夫. He really has Gong Fu. A chef, 真有功夫. And the Southern, our understanding of Chinese culture was based on an immigrant community that was very, very poor, suffering immensely in famine to the point that they left their country, got on ships, and basically worked as slaves on the railroads in California and the West. So you'd have to imagine that. Imagine if a major catastrophe happened in the poor quarters of New Orleans, and those people all got up and they went to Malaysia, and they set up a little like New Orleans town in Malaysia, and they brought their culture, and then everyone said, "Oh, that's what Americans are like." Well, if you're from that part of New Orleans, and we have a very uh, myopic view of Chineseness based on this immigrant population. And that population, if you could fight, you'd say has Gong Fu, like they put their time in to learn how to fight because fighting was a common thing. So then that became this sort of idea of you describe someone who in their spare time learned to do good martial arts as having Gong Fu. But that same word is used for anyone who in their free time didn't squander their free time. They used it to get very good at a skill. And so Gong Fu implies using your free time well instead of squandering it to master an art, any art, even though it's become colloquially used for martial arts in movies and conversation and things like that.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I kind of thought it was the way that I've seen it used is to reference like someone's level of awareness, or just, like some people would call it level of consciousness or
That's it.
understanding the true nature of things. One thing that I found really fascinating in a talk that you were giving with acupuncturists is how it is actually like that level of understanding of the Tao that will create transformational leaps in your practice, more so than perhaps, becoming a better technician.
Right.
And I think this is like such an important idea that it's widely applicable to really, in my opinion, anything that I would love to hear you talk about.
Well, it's one of the things I say that for me, um, my first exposure to Chinese medicine was my own broken bones, and so I never had this idea that it was something mystical or magical. It was broken bones. Chinese medicine fixed it, and then I was studying medicine in the mainland, and when I learned the first bone I set myself was a coccyx, right? So I was with Dr. Xie, and this 70 plus year old man was trying to cross the barrier that they were trying to keep the people from stop running across the road because they kept getting hit by cars. And he fell off the barrier and broke his coccyx. So the Dr. Xie, we went to do a house call, and he said, "It's time for you to learn to set the bone yourself." And you set a coccyx by sliding one finger into the anus and the other outside, and then you have to wiggle the bones to get everything back in place, right? I was so excited. I was so like, he trusts me. And years later, we were giving a seminar, and that story came up, and he started laughing. And I said, "What?" And he goes, "The only reason I had you did it is that 70-year-old guy had shit coming out of his ass, and he was dirty." And I was like, "I'm not touching that. I'm giving it to the foreigner." And there I was like, "I'm so rewarded." And he was like, "Ooh, that's for the student." But all that joking aside is that medicine for me never had a chance to become something spiritually magical. And so I'm very well aware that the level of skill I have, the only thing that can make my skill get dramatically better besides a conscious leap is a famine, a war, that something happens and all electricity disappears, and I'm suddenly frontline medicine dealing with emergency treatments. And just like the very fathers of our Chinese medicine and mothers, that they were in a time of war and famine and suffering, it's going to take that level of illness around me for me to understand more what the books are saying than if somebody's coming in with menopausal issues or autoimmune condition or they have high cholesterol. I mean, there's only so much I can climb at this point without something awful happening to the world. So I'm very happy with where I am, hoping that I'm going to get those mental leaps of clarity, which is why I keep reading those books. And as I said earlier, that every time we read the classics, we hear something different not because it wrote something differently. It's the same words. It's how I'm thinking about life, how I'm thinking about medicine changes. And I go, oh my goodness. So one of the jokes I say is that if I had a time machine, I would go back in time and give money back to every single patient who ever paid me, even the ones who got better. Because now I know what I didn't know then. Like, what was I doing practicing medicine when I didn't know that? And of course, they all got better. And I was already well known, and people would come to me. I was the person you were supposed to go to if nobody else could fix it. And when I look back at that person, I think, they didn't know anything at all. And therefore, I know in another 20 years, I'm going to think the same thing about this now, but at least now I know. I like to joke that the mark of a good practitioner and my skill is how big the bruise is on my forehead, because I don't get better by going, haha, you see that got better? I go by going, oh, how did I miss that? And the more times I'm smacking my head, the more progress I'm making. And really, at this point, it's those moments of awareness and clarity that shift the words in the book to a deeper understanding, so I'm cleaner with my treatment, so that they get better more quickly, that they get better with less fatigue, that there's less repercussions, that I got them, now I see a lot of iatrogenic alternative medicine where they're getting someone better now, but that person at 70 is going to be a sick 70-year-old, not a healthy 70-year-old. And they'll say, oh, that disease I had in my 50s, it sure was bad. No, actually, it was iatrogenic medicine, alternative or Western, that was so bull in the china shop getting you better that by the time your organs aged, there was just too much. They didn't age well because of the uncleanliness of the treatment given. And we look at the success. I'm more focused on how to get to that success in a way that better reflects what the books say, which is how to do it without making other things worse or damaging them in the long run.
What's coming up for me with this discussion is this idea that there is this like self-existent truth about the true nature of things. And like, as you go on this journey, everything stays the same. Like you're in the same, experience, but your ability to understand that truth or see a portion of it increases. And so it's kind of like, how I think about it is like, as my capacity to see truth and align to the truth that's self-existent, that already exists, increases, then it makes everything easier because I'm aligned to that.
That's exactly it. It's that tuning fork idea of clarity. And for me, because it's not in the Western consciousness to strive for this or to know it's there, whether I choose to pay attention to it or not, we age unhappily. But if you're on the journey as you just described it, or as I'm on, I mean, I'm in no hurry to get there, but I can't wait to be 80, right? Because I'm 57, and yeah, I can't keep up with my kid on a mountain bike anymore, and I can't do what I used to do. But the mental harmony is so much better now than it was, and as I lose my youth and what I can do that way, I'm gaining something that I value more, that I find it tickles me so much more than being the athlete I was, the warrior I was, being able to do more than other people, last longer, eat more, whatever it was that youth gave me. I would not trade that headspace for that body, even though I had a great time at that headspace. I was lucky. I mean, I was with these great teachers. I wasn't like, having a bad experience and being shocked into awareness. I was having a great experience, but I wouldn't go back there in a second because this is so much more interesting. One of the things that's been fascinating is, I practiced medicine in cities, and I can recognize a dead plant from a mile away, right? It's dried and it's in a pharmacy, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. But you stick me in a field, I don't know what it is. Right? It's like you put me in a forest, and I'm like, there's got to be medicine here somewhere. And when we came back to the States, we have a farm, and we grow Chinese medicinal herbs. We grow tea. We're farming to supply our clinic with really good quality herbs. And suddenly I'm seeing these plants that I've always known as what they really are in nature. And I go, oh, there's that bruise, right? That's why it does what it does. Look how it grows. In the middle of winter, it's happy. Everything else is wilted, and it's going, I love the cold. And you wonder why that root takes care of a high fever, right? I mean, there's so much knowledge when you see the wholeness of the plant and not just the dread plant and what you study in a book. And I will say, with the passing of my teachers, that having a farm has been the next greatest teacher I have, because when you read the older books that really talk about the plants, they talk about them and what they do at different months of the year. And now I'm seeing them, what they look like at different months of the year. And I say, yeah, of course you juice it in May. The thing is so vibrant and lush, if you squeeze it, it leaks liquid. And of course you use the seeds in September. And of course, come post frost, I'm going to go for those roots because the chi's gone back in, the leaves have wilted. Uh, it's such a common sense reality. And I'm primed for it because my teachers taught me that the old books were common sense, not high knowledge. And then once again, here I am looking at a farm being, it's common sense again. It never leaves common sense. And if we can remember that, things get deeper. And it's in their simplicity, when we recognize how more and more simple things are, that we see the miao in Chinese, or that magicalness, that mysticalness, that thing that everyone's trying to seek by going to the mountain. Actually, it's by recognizing how simple everything really is if we clear ourselves. What I call having a centered self and not being self-centered, right? So the more I stop being self-centered and the more I have a centered self, the more the world stops being busy, the more I see it clearly, the more I realize that it's the simplicity that is so mystical, magical. Not that it's actually complicated, mystical, magical. It's simplicity of harmony of connection. And you go, oh, and someone comes along and says, why are you so excited about that? And it's like, don't you get it? It's this. And they're like, yeah, that's really simple. Yes. And, if they don't laugh at you, it's not the Tao, or at least that's what Lao Tzu said in chapter 41. If you spreading the gospel and people aren't laughing at you, something's wrong.
I love it. And I love this example with seeing plants in nature, because yeah, I mean, I think to most Westerners, the idea of like, use this herb at this time of year sounds a little loony, right? But when you take it in a more complete context, it's like, yeah, this plant's the healthiest then, or it's the most vibrant, or it's the richest. And obviously, if it's vibrant out there, it might have an impact on us. And
It does. And that's why our farm, we're working so hard, because the quality of herbs that we produce are not only better quality because of the soil and we're organic and all those things, but that they weren't mass produced for a market. We're producing them because we want to have these plants. And so we're going to pick a varietal that isn't as abundant, but has more juju to it. And we're going to harvest it at the right time. And if the rains come in or the bugs eat it, we're not going to cover it with pesticides. Oh, well, for this year, because we're interested in the juju of the plant, not the business of the plant. And so it's like a tomato. I mean, you can buy a tomato anytime you want, but only in August, if you grew it yourself, does it have any flavor. Otherwise, it's just a red thing on your plate. And that's true for medicine now. As we had one plant, and I'm used to prescribing 30 grams of it in a formula, right? And we had this batch, and it was green and vibrant, and usually it's kind of brownish and not so good. So I write 30 grams, and I stopped and I said, you know what? We should taste this before I prescribe this to a patient. 30 grams was so strong. 6 grams was all I needed, because it was a live, living plant, grown well, and not 5 years old, sitting in a warehouse to be sold to the West. I mean, the shock of the potency that's available if we have it, and then how many plants are popular because they're really easy to grow. It's like, how much of it was just common sense, how much of it has got more juju, how much of it is, yeah, you do have to use a lot of it, because it's famous not because it's powerful. It's famous because it's growing everywhere, so anyone can harvest it at most any time of from spring to fall, right? And it changes everything when you have these natural perspectives based on the growing cycles and availability.
Well said. Well, Andrew, this has been such a fun conversation. I could talk to you. I have a feeling I could talk to you like you talk to your students, or your teachers rather, where I could sit there all day and just bask in the wisdom. So perhaps we'll have to do another one of these in the future. But I just want to say thank you, and I also want to give you the opportunity to share where people can learn more about your work and the nonprofit you started and just all the different things that you're doing.
Well, we are, because we're so enamored with what we do, we're terrible at marketing. We don't really do social media or anything else like that. And we're trying, but it's like the Amish driving a tractor. We're not so good at it, but we're easy to find at traditionalstudies.org. So easy. We're the Association for Traditional Studies. That's our 501c3 not-for-profit. The website's traditionalstudies.org. From there, you can jump to our online teaching platform where there's videos on Daoism, there's videos on Chinese medicine, there's videos on herbs, there's Tai Chi, there's Qigong, there's Daoyin, everything we do. It also has a list of all the places we teach live. So, we teach extensively all over Europe and now the United States as well in our own teaching facility where I am today. So we're easy to find if you make the effort to find us.
Just like your own experience,
That's
with
the
finding your
irony has not
teachers.
been lost on me.
Amazing. Well, we'll make sure to link all that out. And thanks again, Andrew. This was a lot of fun.
Scott, I really appreciate you being interested and excited to have the world know more about all these things and share it all.
Absolutely.